Evening dreamers, lower the mask and rest easy. No one needs saving tonight. Tonight, we drift back through the saddest story in the whole city of shadows. The story of a gentle man who loved his wife more than his own life, who froze her to save her, and who was frozen himself, in body and in heart, in a single terrible moment of loss he could never leave behind. Nothing tonight will ask anything of you. You don't need to remember any of it. You don't need to follow every turn. You can let every word drift past you like snow falling soft and silent through the beam of a street lamp, like frost spreading slowly across a dark window. And that is exactly how this is meant to be heard. Slowly, gently, with no particular place to be. Tonight, we are going to drift through the story of a figure that most people think of as a villain, and who is, in truth, one of the most heartbreaking figures in all of these stories. Because he is not really a villain, not in the way we usually mean it. He is a grieving man, a man broken by love and loss, a scientist who wanted only to save the person he loved most in all the world, and who lost everything trying, and who was left, at the end, frozen. Frozen in body, unable ever again to feel warmth, and frozen in heart, unable ever to move past the single moment when everything went wrong. His is a story soaked in cold, and in sorrow, and in a love so deep and so desperate that it curdled, at last, into something tragic. And there is something strangely fitting, softly, about drifting through such a story on a quiet winter night at the edge of sleep. Because it is a story about stillness, about the cold, about a heart held forever in a single frozen moment. And there are few things gentler to rest on as you drift towards sleep than the soft, silent, endless falling of snow. But there is no need to hurry toward any of it. We have all night and the whole long story to tell, and it is meant to carry you down into sleep, not to keep you here with me. So before we begin, get comfortable. Turn the lights down low or off completely. Rest your head against something soft. And if you feel like it, before you drift too far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a gentle thing we like to imagine, all the quiet rooms this voice travels into. A warm apartment high above a snowy city, a small house at the end of a long, dark road with the frost on the windows, a bed by a window somewhere with the snow coming down, or the rain, or the still, cold air of a deep winter night. Wherever you are, you're welcome here, where it's warm. And if these quiet stories help you find your way down into sleep, you're always welcome to follow along, so the light's still on tomorrow night and the night after that. There's no rush at all. We have all the time in the world. Let's begin. Before we drift into his story, softly, here is a small, true thing about him, because it is genuinely surprising, and it makes his tragedy all the more remarkable. Because for a very long time, he was not a tragic figure at all. When he first appeared, long ago, back in the late 1950s, he was something much simpler and much sillier. He was a gimmick, a minor villain with an ice theme and a freezing gun, one of many colorful crooks who menaced the great detective of the City of Shadows, no deeper or sadder than any of the others. He even had a different name at first, a name that has mostly been forgotten. For decades, he was just that, a cold-themed criminal, a punster with a freeze ray, a forgettable face in a crowded gallery of villains, remembered by almost no one, mattering to almost no one. And then, softly, something remarkable happened, something that is one of the loveliest stories in the whole history of these characters. Because in the early 1990s, a beloved animated television version of The Great Detective's World was being made, and a talented writer was given the task of doing something with this forgotten, silly ice villain. And instead of keeping him a gimmick, this writer had an idea. What if the cold was not just a theme, but a symbol? What if the man of ice was cold not because it was a gimmick, but because his heart had frozen, because he had suffered a loss so terrible that all the warmth had gone out of him? What if, underneath the freezing gun and the ice theme, there was a story of profound and heartbreaking grief? And so the writer took this forgotten joke of a villain and gave him a new origin, a tragic one, a love story turned to sorrow, and in a single episode of television, transformed him completely. The silly gimmick became one of the most tragic and beloved figures in the whole mythology. That episode won a major award, and the transformation was so powerful, so beautiful, so complete, that it was carried back into the comics themselves and became, from then on, the true and official story of who he was. There is something wonderful in that, softly, worth resting on gently before we even begin his tale. The idea that a forgotten, silly, throwaway character could be transformed by a single act of imaginative sympathy into something deeply moving. That someone looked at a joke of a villain and saw, hidden inside him, the possibility of a genuine tragedy and brought it out and gave the character a soul. It is a small miracle of storytelling, the way a writer can reach into a hollow thing and fill it with grief and love and meaning. And it means that the sad and beautiful story we are about to drift through was not there from the beginning. It was found, later, inside a character no one had cared about, by someone who looked closely enough to see what he could become. And what he became was this: the saddest man in the whole city of shadows. Let's drift, now, gently, into how his heart came to freeze. Let's drift now into the man he was before the cold ever touched him, softly, because to understand his tragedy, you have to understand what he had and what he lost. Because before he was a figure of ice, before he was a villain, before his heart ever froze, he was simply a man. A brilliant man, yes, one of the finest scientific minds of his generation, a specialist in the study of extreme cold, of freezing, of the strange things that happen to living tissue at temperatures far below anything the natural world produces. But he was, above all, just a man. A quiet, gentle, thoughtful man, devoted to his work, and devoted even more deeply to one other thing, to the woman he loved, because he had a wife, softly. And here is where the whole tragedy takes root, because his love for her was not an ordinary love. It was the great fact of his existence, the center around which everything else revolved. He loved her completely, wholly, with a depth and a tenderness that defined who he was. She was, by every telling, a warm and gentle soul, kind and lovely and full of life, and he loved her the way you love the one person who makes the whole world make sense. In a life spent studying the cold, in a career devoted to ice and freezing and the deep chill of the laboratory, she was his warmth, his one warm thing, the sun around which his quiet, cold, scientific life turned. And he was happy, truly happy, in the way that only a person who loves and is loved in return can be happy. He had his work, which he was gifted at, and he had her, whom he adored, and that was enough. That was everything. Let's rest a moment on that happiness, softly, because it is important, and because it will make everything that follows so much sadder. Picture their life together before the cold came. A quiet, loving marriage. Two people devoted to each other, building a life, sharing the small, ordinary warmth of days spent together. Him in his laboratory, absorbed in his work, but always coming home to her. Her, the warmth at the center of it all, the reason for everything. It was not a dramatic life, not a famous life, just a quiet, good one. The kind of life that so many people dream of and so few fully have. Two people who loved each other completely, living gently together, warm against the cold of the world. That was what he had, and it is worth dwelling on, softly, because we so rarely appreciate that kind of quiet happiness until it is gone. He had it. For a time, he had the thing that matters most of all, a love that was real and warm and whole. And here, softly, is where the cold begins to creep in, quietly, at the edges, the way frost creeps across a window in the night. Because his beloved wife fell ill, not with an ordinary illness, not something that rest and medicine could cure, but with something terrible, a rare and fatal disease, a sickness with no known cure that would, slowly and certainly, take her from him. Imagine receiving that news. Imagine being told that the person you love most in all the world, the warm center of your whole existence, is dying, and that there is nothing anyone can do. That the doctors have no answer, that the illness will run its course and she will be gone, and you will be left alone in a world suddenly emptied of its only warmth. That is the news he received, and for most people, that would be the whole of the tragedy, the slow, terrible loss of a beloved spouse to an incurable disease. It is one of the most common and most devastating of all human sorrows. But he was not most people, softly. He was one of the greatest scientists of his age, a specialist in exactly the kind of science that might, just might, offer a sliver of hope. And so, faced with the impending loss of everything, he did not simply accept it. He did not surrender to the grief. He fought, because he had an idea, a desperate, brilliant, terrible idea. If he could not cure her illness now, in the time she had left, then perhaps he could stop time itself for her. Perhaps he could use his mastery of the cold, his lifetime of studying how to freeze and preserve, to place her in a state of frozen suspension, to halt her illness where it stood, to keep her alive, held gently in ice, in a kind of endless suspended sleep, while he searched, for however long it took, for the cure that would one day wake her and heal her. He would freeze her to save her. He would use the cold, his whole life's work, to hold back death itself, and buy the time he needed to find a way to bring her back. It was a mad hope, but it was a hope, and a man who loves that deeply will grasp at any hope at all, however slender, rather than simply watch the person he loves slip away. Let's drift, now, into the moment everything changed, softly, the accident at the heart of his whole tragedy, because it is where his old life ended and his frozen life began. Because he did it. He froze her. In a laboratory, using all his genius and all his equipment, he gently placed his dying wife into a state of frozen stasis, halting her illness, preserving her, holding her safe and still in ice, in a deep and silent sleep, so that she would not die while he searched for the cure. Picture that, softly. A man, in a cold laboratory, tenderly freezing the person he loves most in all the world, not to hurt her, but to save her, sealing her away in ice like a sleeping figure in an old story, promising her, silently, that he will find a way to wake her, that he will not rest until he brings her back, that this is not goodbye, but only a long, long sleep. It is one of the most tender and desperate acts of love imaginable. A man freezing his beloved to keep her from dying, and vowing to thaw her back into life someday, whatever it takes. But there was a problem, softly, and it is the problem that turns his love story into a tragedy. Because the equipment he was using, the laboratory, the vast, expensive machinery required for such an undertaking, did not belong to him. It belonged to the company he worked for, and to the powerful, wealthy man who owned that company. And this man, his employer, was not a good man. He was cold in a way that had nothing to do with ice, cold in the heart, ruthless, greedy, caring for nothing but profit and his own advancement. And when this powerful man discovered what his scientist was doing, when he found out that his employee was using the company's expensive equipment for his own private, unauthorized purpose, to freeze and preserve a dying wife, he did not feel sympathy. He did not feel compassion. He felt only anger, that his resources were being used without his permission, that his money was being spent on something that would not profit him. And he moved to stop it. And here, softly, is the terrible moment, the accident that froze a man's heart forever. Because the powerful employer came to the laboratory to shut the experiment down, to end it, to stop the scientist from using the company's equipment to save his wife. And there was a confrontation. A desperate scientist trying to protect the frozen wife who was his whole world, and a cold, angry, powerful man determined to stop him. And in that confrontation, something went horribly wrong. In the struggle, the scientist was thrown, or knocked, into the very chemicals and equipment he used for his freezing work. He was doused, drenched, exposed to the extreme cold substances that were the tools of his trade. And the powerful employer, rather than helping him, simply left him there, left him for dead amid the freezing chemicals, and walked away. But he did not die softly. Something stranger and sadder than death happened to him. Because the exposure to those extreme cold substances did not kill him, it transformed him. It changed his body at the deepest level, altering him permanently, terribly, so that his physiology was rewritten by the cold. And when it was done, he was no longer quite human, not in the way he had been. His body had been remade by the freezing chemicals, so that now, horribly, he could only survive in extreme cold. The warmth that every living thing needs, the warmth that is the very condition of ordinary life, had become poison to him. If he stepped into a warm room, an ordinary room, the kind of room you are resting in now, he would sicken and weaken and die. He could only live in the deep cold, in temperatures far below freezing, the kind of cold that would kill an ordinary person in minutes. He had become a creature of ice, able to exist only in the frozen conditions that would be lethal to anyone else. Let's sit with the horror and the sadness of that transformation, softly, because it is the physical form of his whole tragedy. A man who had spent his life studying the cold became, by a terrible accident, a prisoner of it. To survive, from that day on, he would have to wear a special suit, an armored, refrigerated suit that kept his body at the freezing temperatures he now required, a suit he could never take off, not ever, not for a single moment, without dying. Think about what that means. He could never again feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. He could never again feel the warmth of a fire, or a warm room, or a warm bath. And most terribly of all, softly, he could never again feel the warmth of another person's touch. He could never hold anyone. He could never be held. The simple human warmth of an embrace, of a hand on his shoulder, of the touch of the person he loved, was closed to him forever. He was sealed away, inside his cold suit, in his cold body, cut off from all warmth, from all touch, from all the ordinary physical tenderness that makes life bearable. He had become, in the most literal and most heartbreaking way, untouchable. A man who could never again feel warmth in a world that runs on it. Let's pause a moment, softly, on the one who caused it all, because there is an injustice at the root of his tragedy that is worth sitting with, gently, because it deepens our sympathy for him and complicates the whole question of who the real villain is. Because the man who ruined him, the powerful employer who cut off his research and caused the accident and left him for dead, was never punished, was never held to account, went on with his comfortable, wealthy, powerful life, while the gentle scientist he had destroyed was transformed into a hunted, frozen creature, cut off from all warmth, robbed of everything he loved. The one who did the real wrong walked free, and the one who was wronged became the villain the world would fear. There is a deep injustice in that, softly, worth resting on gently, and the story wants us to feel it. Because who, really, is the villain of this tale? Is it the grieving scientist who only ever wanted to save his dying wife and who was broken by forces beyond his control? Or is it the cold, greedy, powerful man who valued his profits over a human life, who destroyed a good man's last desperate hope, who caused a catastrophe and then walked away without a backward glance? The world calls the man of ice a villain, but his villainy was made, created, caused by the true coldness of a powerful man who felt nothing, who cared for nothing but his own gain, whose heart was colder, in its way, than any amount of ice. The real coldness in the story is not the frozen scientists. It is the frozen heart of the powerful man who ruined him, and who was never called a villain at all, because his cruelty wore the respectable mask of wealth and power and profit. There is a hard truth in that, softly, worth carrying gently, about the difference between the coldness the world condemns and the coldness it excuses. Because the world fears the obvious monster, the frightening figure of ice, and calls him villain, but it often fails to see, or chooses not to see, the quieter, more respectable coldness that causes so much of the world's real harm. The coldness of greed. The coldness of power that values profit over people. The coldness of those who ruin lives not in dramatic acts of villainy, but in quiet decisions made in comfortable offices, choosing money over mercy, gain over goodness, and walking away untouched. That coldness rarely wears a frightening face. It rarely gets called villainy, but it is, so often, the true source of the harm, the real cold heart at the center of so many tragedies. And his story quietly asks us to see it, to recognize that the frightening figure of ice was made by a colder heart that never faced any consequences at all. Let's drift, now, into the deeper meaning of what happened to him, softly, because his transformation was not just a physical catastrophe, it was a symbol, a perfect and terrible symbol of what had happened to his soul. Because think about the cruel poetry of it. Here was a man who had just suffered the deepest loss a person can suffer, the loss of the one he loved, watching her frozen away, perhaps forever, uncertain if he would ever bring her back. His heart, in that moment, had gone cold with grief. And then, as if the universe wished to make his inner state visible, his body was frozen too, made cold, made unable to feel warmth, transformed on the outside into exactly what he had become on the inside. A cold thing, a frozen thing, a being from whom all warmth had fled. That is what makes his story so much more than a simple accident, softly, worth resting on gently. The cold that took his body is the same cold that took his heart. He is frozen twice over, frozen in his flesh, unable to feel physical warmth, and frozen in his spirit, unable to feel emotional warmth, locked away in his grief, cut off from joy, from hope, from all the warm feelings that make life worth living. The suit that seals his body away from the warm world is a mirror of the grief that seals his heart away from the warm world of feeling. He is a man encased in ice, inside and out, and everything he does afterward, all his coldness, all his ruthlessness, all the villainy the world would come to fear, flows from that double freezing, that total loss of warmth in body and soul alike. And there was a second loss folded inside the first, softly, that made it all even worse. Because remember why he had done any of it. He had frozen his wife to save her, planning to spend his life searching for her cure, planning to wake her and heal her someday. But now, transformed, hunted, cut off, made into a monster, that plan was in ruins. His laboratory was gone. His work was destroyed. His wife, his frozen, sleeping wife, was lost to him, taken, hidden away, kept from him by the very forces that had ruined him. So he had not only lost his warmth, his humanity, his ordinary life, he had also lost her, a second time. First to the illness, and now to the catastrophe that had transformed him. The one thing that might have given his frozen existence any meaning, the hope of saving her, waking her, being with her again, had been torn away. He was left with nothing. No warmth, no wife, no hope, no life. Only the cold and the grief and the terrible memory of everything he had lost. Let's sit with the completeness of that loss, softly, because it is what breaks him and what makes him what he becomes. Because a person can survive a great deal if they have something to hold on to, some hope, some purpose, some warm thing at the center of the cold. But he had lost even that. Everything warm in his life had been taken. His wife, frozen and lost. His body, frozen and ruined. His future, frozen and gone. His heart, frozen and still. And when a person loses everything, when every warm thing is stripped away and nothing is left but cold and grief, something happens to them. Something breaks, or hardens, or changes. The warmth that made them human recedes, and something colder takes its place. That is what happened to him. In the ruins of his life, with everything lost, the gentle, loving scientist he had been slowly froze over, and in his place there emerged something new, something cold, something driven. A man of ice, animated by grief and loss, moving through a world that had become, for him, nothing but cold. There is a profound truth in that, softly, worth resting on gently, about what grief can do to a person when it has nothing to soften it. Because grief, held in a warm and loving context, surrounded by support and connection and hope, can be survived, can even, in time, become a kind of tender remembering. But grief in isolation, grief with no warmth around it, grief that has lost everything and has nothing left to hold on to, can turn cold, can harden into something else, can freeze a person from the inside out until they are no longer the warm-feeling being they once were, but something colder, harder, more distant, encased in the ice of their own sorrow. He is the perfect and terrible picture of that. A man whose grief, having nothing warm left to hold it, froze him solid, body and soul, and turned him from a gentle, loving scientist into the cold and sorrowful figure the world would come to fear. Not evil, exactly, not cruel for the joy of it, just frozen. A heart turned entirely to ice by a loss too total to bear. Let's drift, softly, into one more layer of what he lost, before we rest at the halfway point, because it is subtle and deeply sad, and easy to overlook beneath the more obvious losses. He lost himself, the person he used to be, because the gentle, warm, loving scientist, the man who laughed, who loved, who felt the ordinary warmth of an ordinary human life, that man is gone. Not dead, exactly, but frozen, buried, lost beneath the ice of what he became. The man of ice who moves through the story now is not the man who first walked into that laboratory. He is what was left after the warmth was stripped away. A colder, harder, sadder version, wearing the face of the man he used to be, but hollowed out, frozen through, changed almost beyond recognition. There is something especially tragic in that kind of loss, softly, worth resting on gently, because it is a loss of a very particular kind. It is one thing to lose the people we love, terrible as that is, but it is another, stranger grief to lose ourselves, to become so changed by suffering that we are no longer the person we used to be, to look back at who we once were as at a stranger, a person we can barely remember being. He suffered both losses. He lost his wife, and he lost himself. The warm, loving self he had been, frozen away by grief and catastrophe until only the cold remained. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the ice, that gentle, warm man he used to be is still there, perhaps, mourning, trapped, unable to get out, unable to thaw, a warm soul frozen forever inside a cold and altered being. There is a quiet, gentle truth in that, softly, that touches something many people know, worth carrying towards sleep. Because suffering changes us. Great loss, great grief, great pain can alter a person so deeply that they feel they have lost themselves, become someone colder, harder, sadder than they used to be. And there is a real grief in that, the grief of missing not only the people we have lost, but the person we used to be before we lost them. He is the extreme and tragic image of that. A man so changed by his suffering that his old warm self was frozen away entirely. But his story also holds, quietly, a gentler possibility for those of us who are not frozen solid as he was. That the warm self is not truly gone, only buried, only waiting, and that with enough warmth, enough time, enough gentleness, it can thaw and return, and we can find our way back to who we were, carrying our losses, but no longer frozen by them. He never found that thaw, but the possibility of it, the hope of the warm self returning after the long cold of grief, is a gentle thing to rest on, and a real one, for hearts less frozen than his. We have come a long way already, you and I. That is worth noticing, softly, before we go on. We began with a forgotten, silly villain, transformed into a tragic figure, and we have drifted through the gentle man he was before, the wife he loved, the illness that threatened her, the desperate act of freezing her to save her, the accident that froze him too, and the double loss that turned his heart entirely to ice. If you are still here with me, drifting somewhere on the soft edge of sleep, there is no need to hold on to any of it. The details will keep. What matters is the slow, quiet, cool current of the story in the dark, and that will carry you just fine, whether you remember a single thing or not. So let your grip loosen a little more, if it hasn't already. Sink a little deeper into the warm, safe from all the cold of the story. We are about halfway along the road tonight, and the saddest and most tender part is still ahead. Let's carry on, slowly, together. Let's drift, now, into the one thing that still drives him, softly. The single purpose that survived the freezing of his heart, because it is the key to understanding everything he does, and it is, in its way, deeply moving. Because even after everything, even frozen in body and soul, even turned into a cold and fearsome figure, one warm ember remained, buried deep, refusing to go out entirely. His love for her. His devotion to his frozen, sleeping wife. It was the one thing the cold could not fully kill, and it became, from then on, the single organizing purpose of his entire existence. Because everything he does, softly, all of it, every act the world would call villainy, is for her. Think about that, and let it reframe everything. When he steals, He is not stealing for greed. He is stealing to fund his research, the endless, desperate research to find the cure that will heal her and wake her. When he builds his machines, his weapons, his cold devices, he does it to gather the resources and the technology he needs to save her. When he fights, when he defies the great detective who opposes him, when he does the cold, hard things the world condemns, it is almost always, at the root, in service of that one purpose: to save his wife, to find her cure, to wake her from her frozen sleep and hold her again, warm and living, and undo, somehow, the terrible thing that was done to them both. He is not a man pursuing power or wealth or chaos. He is a man pursuing his wife's salvation, single-mindedly, obsessively, with all the cold focus his frozen heart can muster. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that, softly, worth resting on gently, because it means that his villainy is, at its heart, an act of love. A terrible, misguided, destructive act of love, but love nonetheless. He does wrong, real wrong, wrong that hurts people, and the story never pretends otherwise. But the engine of it all is not hate or greed or cruelty. It is devotion. It is a husband who will not give up on his dying wife. It is a man who loves so deeply that he will do anything, cross any line, become anything, to save the one he loves. And there is a strange and heartbreaking nobility in that, tangled up with all the wrong of it. The nobility of a love that will not surrender, that will not accept defeat, that keeps fighting long after any reasonable person would have given up. He is a villain, yes, but he is a villain made entirely of love. A man whose every cold crime is, underneath, a desperate cry of devotion to the warm woman sleeping in the ice. And this is what separates him, softly, from so many other villains, and what makes him so beloved despite the wrong he does. Because we understand him, we feel for him. We cannot fully condemn a man whose only real crime, at the deepest level, is loving too much and being unable to let go. His methods are wrong, the harm he does is real, but his motive is one of the purest and most sympathetic there is. Who among us, faced with the loss of the person we loved most, would not wish for the power to save them? Who would not be tempted, if we had his genius and his desperation, to do almost anything to bring them back? He is not a monster we recoil from. He is a mirror of our own deepest fears and our own deepest loves, the fear of losing the ones we cherish, and the love that would do anything to keep them. And that is why, of all the cold-hearted villains in all the stories, this one, the Man of Ice, is the one whose story brings people to tears. Let's drift, softly, for a moment, to her, to the wife sleeping in the ice, because she is present in his whole story without ever quite being present, a quiet, still, frozen figure at the very center of everything. And there is something haunting and tender in the image of her worth resting on gently. She sleeps, held in her cold suspension, unchanging, unaging, neither living quite as the living do, nor gone as the dead are gone. Held in between, in a frozen stillness, waiting, without knowing she is waiting, for a cure that may or may not ever come. A sleeping figure in ice, beautiful and still and silent, at the heart of a sad, cold story. There is an old, old image in that, softly, one that echoes some of the most ancient and beloved of all stories. The sleeping figure, held in an enchanted sleep, waiting to be woken. The beauty frozen in time, unchanging, preserved, awaiting the moment of awakening that will restore her to life and warmth. It is one of the oldest dreams in all of human storytelling, the dream of a loved one only sleeping, not truly gone, waiting to be woken and returned to us. And his whole tragedy is built on that dream, on the desperate hope that death is only sleep, that loss is only a long, cold waiting, that the beloved is not gone forever but merely frozen, and might yet be thawed and woken and loved again. It is the dream every grieving heart has dreamed, the dream that the one we lost is only sleeping, only waiting, only just beyond our reach, and might somehow be brought back. And there is something unbearably tender in his faithfulness to that dream, softly, worth resting on gently, because he never gives up on her. Through all the long, cold years, through all his transformation and his sorrow and his ruin, he keeps watch over her sleeping form, keeps working to wake her, keeps believing, against all reason, that she can be saved. It is a devotion beyond death, a love that refuses to accept loss, a faithfulness that outlasts everything. And whatever else is wrong in what he does, that faithfulness is beautiful. The image of him keeping his endless watch over her frozen, sleeping form, refusing to abandon her, refusing to let her go, loving her through the endless winter with a devotion that neither cold nor time nor ruin could break, is one of the most tender and heartbreaking images in all of these stories. A love that kept its vigil, faithfully, forever, over a sleeping figure in the ice. There is something in that image, softly, that touches the deepest chord of all, worth carrying gently towards sleep. Because it is, in the end, an image of hope refusing to die, even when hope has become a kind of prison. He keeps his watch because he cannot bear to accept that she is truly gone. And there is both beauty and sorrow in that, tangled together inseparably. The beauty of a love that will not surrender, and the sorrow of a hope that cannot let go, that keeps a grieving heart frozen forever in its waiting, unable to move on, unable to thaw, unable to accept the loss and find its way back to the warmth of living. His faithful watch over her sleeping form is the whole of his tragedy in a single image. Love that outlasts death, and grief that cannot let itself heal. Held together forever in the cold and the silence and the endless faithful waiting. Let's drift, softly, into the difficult moral question at the center of his devotion, because his story does not let us off easily, and it is worth sitting with honestly, even gently, in the dark. Because his love is beautiful, yes, his devotion is moving, but it also leads him to do real harm, to hurt people, to commit real crimes, all in the name of saving the one he loves. And so his story quietly asks one of the hardest questions there is: how far is too far? How much is love allowed to justify? When does devotion, however beautiful, become something that has lost its way? Because there is a point, softly, at which his love, for all its beauty, becomes a kind of blindness. He loves his wife so completely that he ceases, in a sense, to see anyone else. Other people become obstacles or resources or simply irrelevant next to the overwhelming imperative of saving her. He would sacrifice almost anything, almost anyone, to bring her back. And that is where his love, which is beautiful in itself, curdles into something dangerous. Because a love that will harm others to protect its object has crossed a line. It has become a love that serves only itself, that has lost sight of the wider world, that has narrowed to a single point so bright and so consuming that everything else fades into darkness around it. His devotion is real and moving, but it has become the whole of his moral universe, and a moral universe with only one person in it is a dangerous thing. There is a hard truth in that, softly, worth resting on gently, and it applies far beyond his frozen story. Because love, For all that it is the most beautiful thing there is not automatically good. Love can be selfish. Love can be blind. Love can, when it narrows too far and consumes too completely, lead people to do terrible things, all while feeling entirely justified, entirely righteous, because they are doing it for love. The love itself is real, but love alone is not enough. Love must be tempered by something else, by a sense of the wider world, by a care for others beyond the beloved, by the wisdom to know that even the deepest devotion does not justify any harm at all. He lost that tempering. His love became total, and in becoming total, it became blind, and in becoming blind, it led him into harm. And his tragedy is partly the tragedy of a love so deep and so consuming that it lost its moral bearings, that it forgot there was a world beyond the one person at its center. And yet, softly, the story never lets us simply condemn him for it, and that is part of its wisdom. Because we understand the love, we feel its pull. We know that if we loved someone that much and could save them, we too might be tempted to cross lines we should not cross. His moral failure is not the cold calculation of a villain. It is the overwhelming, blinding, all-consuming devotion of a man who loves too much to see clearly. And there is something almost forgivable in that, even amid the harm. Something that keeps him human, keeps him sympathetic, even as we recognize that what he does is wrong. He is not evil. He is lost. Lost in a love so deep it swallowed his whole moral world. And there is a difference between the two, a difference the story asks us to feel, gently, even as it refuses to pretend that his love excuses the harm it leads him to do. Let's drift now into the deepest psychological truth of his whole tragedy, softly, the thing that the image of the cold captures so perfectly. It is the idea of being frozen in grief, of being unable to move on, unable to let go, unable to thaw, because that, more than anything, is what his cold really represents. Not just a physical condition, but a state of the soul, the state of a person who has been so wounded by loss that they have, in a sense, stopped, frozen in place, trapped forever in the single moment when everything went wrong, unable to move forward into any future that does not contain the person they lost. Think about what grief does to us, softly, at its most extreme. When we lose someone we love deeply, there is a way in which time seems to stop. The world goes on, but we do not. We are held, fixed, in the moment of loss, unable to imagine a future, unable to move past it, unable to accept that life is supposed to continue. Everyone who has grieved deeply knows this feeling, the sense of being stuck, frozen, while the warm, ordinary world flows on around you, untouched. For most people, softly, that frozen state slowly, gradually thaws. Time passes. The ice of grief slowly melts. We begin, painfully, to move again, to feel again, to imagine a future again, to let the warmth back in. It is one of the mercies of being human that grief, however terrible, usually thaws in time. But he cannot thaw softly. That is his tragedy, made literal. His grief has frozen him solid, and it will not melt. He is stuck forever in the moment of his loss, unable to move on, unable to accept, unable to let the warmth back in, both literally in his frozen body and figuratively in his frozen heart. He cannot move forward because moving forward would mean accepting that his wife is gone, or might be gone, and he cannot accept that. He cannot let go because letting go feels like betraying her, like giving up on her, like admitting that all his love was not enough to save her. And so he stays, frozen, in the endless winter of his grief, refusing to thaw, refusing to move on, holding forever to the single frozen moment of his loss, unable and unwilling to let it melt into the past. There is a profound and gentle wisdom hidden in his tragedy, softly, worth resting on as the night deepens. Because his story shows us, in dramatic and heartbreaking form, what happens to a person who cannot let their grief thaw, who holds on too tightly, too long, to a loss they cannot accept. It is understandable. It is even in a way beautiful, the refusal to let go of someone you loved so much. But it is also, his story quietly suggests, a kind of death. Because a person frozen forever in their grief is not really living. They are held in ice, stopped, unable to feel the warmth of the present, unable to move into any future, sacrificing the whole rest of their life on the altar of a loss they will not release. He gave up everything, his warmth, his humanity, his future, his very self, to hold on to a frozen moment that had already passed. And there is a terrible sadness in that, the sadness of a life frozen solid around a single loss, unable ever to thaw and flow again into something living and warm. And there is a gentle lesson in it, softly, for all of us who have grieved or who will grieve, as everyone must. That grief, however deep, is meant eventually to thaw. That holding on forever, refusing to let the ice melt, is not the truest form of love, but a kind of trap, a frozen prison that keeps us from the warmth of continuing to live. The ones we lose would not want us frozen forever in our sorrow. They would want us, in time, to thaw, to feel warmth again, to move forward, carrying their memory not as a block of ice that stops us, but as a warm and tender thing that we take with us into a future that continues. He never learned that. He never let the ice melt. And so his love, which was beautiful, became a prison, which was tragic. And his story stands as a gentle warning, wrapped in sorrow, that even the deepest grief is meant, in the end, to thaw, so that the warmth of life can flow again, and we can go on living, carrying our losses gently in a heart that has allowed itself to stay warm. Let's drift, softly, into the strange endurance of his hope, because it is one of the most remarkable things about him, and it holds a truth about the human heart worth resting on gently. Because think about how long he keeps going, through years sometimes, or longer, through failure after failure, through every defeat, every setback, every dead end in his endless research, through a transformation that ruined his body and a catastrophe that took everything. And still, he does not stop. Still, he keeps working, keeps searching, keeps believing that somehow, someday, he will find the cure, wake his wife, undo the loss. His hope, against all reason, against all evidence, simply will not die. There is something almost superhuman in that endurance, softly, worth resting on gently, and it is both his glory and his curse. Because on one hand, there is a genuine magnificence in a hope that refuses to surrender, a love that will not give up no matter how impossible the task, a devotion that endures through every failure and every year. It is, in its way, awe-inspiring, the sheer unbreakable persistence of his hope. Most people would have given up long ago, would have accepted the loss, would have let the hope die. He never does. And there is something magnificent in that refusal, something that commands a kind of awe even amid all the sadness. But on the other hand, softly, his endless hope is also the very thing that traps him, that keeps him frozen, that will not let him heal. Because it is a hope that can never quite be fulfilled and never quite be released. He cannot succeed, not really, not in the way he dreams. But he also cannot give up, cannot let the hope die, cannot accept the loss and move on. And so he is caught, forever, in the endless middle, always hoping, never succeeding, never surrendering, frozen in place by a hope too strong to abandon and too impossible to fulfill. His hope keeps him going, yes, but it also keeps him trapped, unable to move forward, unable to heal, unable to find any peace, because peace would require either success or acceptance, and his endless hope allows him neither. There is a deep and complicated truth in that, softly, worth carrying gently towards sleep, about the double nature of hope itself. Because hope is one of the most beautiful and most necessary things there is, the thing that keeps us going through darkness, that refuses to surrender to despair. But hope can also, sometimes, become a kind of trap, when it fixes on something that can never be, when it will not allow us to accept a loss and move on, when it keeps us frozen forever in a waiting that has no end. There is a wisdom, sometimes, in letting a hope go, in accepting what cannot be changed, in allowing ourselves to grieve and heal and move forward, rather than staying frozen forever in an impossible hope. He never found that wisdom. His hope was magnificent, and it was his prison, both at once, and he could never tell the difference. And so he stayed, forever, frozen in the endless hoping, unable to succeed and unable to let go. And there is a gentle lesson in that, wrapped in sorrow, about the importance of knowing when to hope and when, for our own healing, to gently let a hope come to rest. Let's drift, softly, for a while, into the cold itself, into the winter that surrounds him, because there is a strange beauty in it, and it is a peaceful thing to rest on as the night deepens. Because we tend to think of cold as harsh, as cruel, as something to fear. And for him, it is all of those things, a prison, a curse, the mark of everything he lost. But cold is also, in its way, beautiful. Winter is beautiful. And there is a gentle, mournful loveliness to the frozen world he inhabits that is worth drifting through, softly, before sleep. Think of the beauty of a deep winter night, softly. The snow falling, slow and silent, through the dark, each flake drifting down in its own unhurried time, settling gently over everything, softening the whole world, hushing it into quiet. The way fresh snow lies smooth and perfect over the rooftops in the fields, glowing faintly blue in the moonlight, unmarked, untouched, serene. The delicate lace of frost spreading across a dark window in the night, forming its intricate patterns, fern and feather and crystal, more beautiful than anything a hand could draw. The deep, profound silence of a frozen landscape, where all the ordinary sounds are muffled by the snow, and the world lies still and quiet and at peace beneath its white blanket. There is a real beauty in all of that, a cold and quiet and mournful beauty, the beauty of winter, the beauty of stillness, the beauty of a world held gently in ice. And there is something in that beauty, softly, that suits his sad story perfectly, and that is soothing to rest on, even amid the sorrow. Because winter, for all its cold, is also a time of rest, a time of stillness, a time when the whole natural world slows and quiets and sleeps beneath the snow, waiting, patient, for a spring that will surely come. There is peace in winter, a deep, quiet, restful peace, the peace of a world that has stopped its striving and settled into stillness. And even his frozen sorrow, terrible as it is, carries something of that peace within it, the still, quiet, motionless calm of a heart held in endless winter. It is sad, but it is also, in its stillness, strangely serene, the way a frozen landscape under moonlight is serene, cold and quiet, and utterly at peace. Let's rest a while in that frozen beauty, softly, as sleep draws nearer, because it is one of the gentlest things to drift toward. Imagine the snow falling, soft and silent, all around you, settling over a quiet world. Imagine the deep hush of a winter night, the stillness, the peace, the whole world resting quietly beneath its white blanket. Imagine the delicate frost patterns on the window, the faint blue glow of moonlight on snow, the profound and gentle silence of a frozen world at rest. There is no fear in it now, only stillness, only quiet, only the soft, endless falling of the snow. Let that peace settle over you, gently, the deep, quiet peace of winter, of stillness, of a world held softly in the cold and the dark and the falling snow. It is the very peace he could never find, the peace of a stillness that is restful rather than frozen, of a quiet that soothes rather than traps. But you can find it, tonight, as you drift, wrapped warm and safe while the gentle snow falls silent in the dark. Let's drift now into the strange calm of him, softly, because it is one of the most distinctive and haunting things about him, and it is very different from what you might expect of a villain. Because he is not wild, he is not raving, he does not rant or rage or cackle with cruel glee the way so many villains do. He is quiet. Cold, yes, but calm. Measured. Dignified, even. He speaks softly, slowly, in a voice drained of warmth but full of a deep, sorrowful composure. He moves through his tragedy not with fury, but with a kind of frozen stillness, a mournful quiet. The calm of a man who has already lost everything and has nothing left to be afraid of. There is something deeply fitting in that calm, softly, worth resting on gently, because it is the calm of the truly cold, not the hot, chaotic cruelty of a raging madman, but the cold, still, quiet sorrow of a man frozen solid. Fire rages. Ice is silent, and he is ice, through and through. His emotions do not burn, they freeze. His grief does not scream. It settles into a deep and silent stillness, like a frozen lake, calm on the surface, unimaginably deep and cold beneath. And that quiet, that stillness, that mournful composure is far more haunting than any amount of raving would be, because you can see, in his calm, the depth of what he has lost. A man who rages is still fighting, still hoping, still alive with feeling. A man this calm, this cold, this still, is a man who has passed beyond ordinary feeling into something colder and quieter and sadder. The calm of the truly bereaved, the stillness of a heart frozen solid. And there is a dignity in him, softly, that sets him apart, and that makes his tragedy all the more moving. Because for all that he does wrong, he is never petty, never small, never merely cruel. He carries himself with a mournful nobility, the bearing of a man who was once good and gentle and loving, and who has not entirely forgotten it, even beneath all the ice. There is a sorrow in him that commands a strange respect, the sorrow of a genuinely tragic figure, a man brought low not by his own wickedness, but by love and loss and terrible misfortune. He does not enjoy his villainy. He takes no pleasure in the harm he does. He simply does what he believes he must, to save the one he loves, with a heavy heart and a cold composure, mourning, always, beneath the ice. And that dignity, that mournful nobility, is part of what lifts him above a simple villain and makes him a genuinely tragic one. Let's rest a moment on the particular sadness of his calm, softly, because it is a gentle and haunting thing to sit with as the night grows late. Imagine him, alone, in some cold place, in his frozen suit, surrounded by ice, in the deep quiet of a temperature that would kill anyone else. There is no one with him. There can be no one with him, because he cannot bear warmth, and warm living people cannot bear his cold. He is utterly alone, in the silence and the frost, with only his grief and his memories and his single frozen purpose. And he is calm, quietly, mournfully, terribly calm, working, perhaps, on his endless research, or simply sitting, still, in the cold and the silence, remembering the warmth he has lost, the wife he loved, the life that was taken. There is no rage in him in these moments, only a deep, still, frozen sorrow, quiet as falling snow, endless as winter. It is one of the loneliest images in all of these stories. The calm, cold, sorrowful man, alone in the ice, mourning forever in the silence. There is something in his calm, softly, that touches a deep truth about certain kinds of grief, worth resting on gently. Because the deepest sorrows are often the quietest. The loudest grief, the wailing and the raging, is often the grief that is still fresh, still fighting, still moving toward eventual healing. But there is a deeper grief, a colder grief, that has passed beyond all that into a terrible stillness. The quiet grief of the person who has stopped fighting, stopped hoping in the ordinary way, and settled into a permanent frozen sorrow. It does not rage. It does not weep, even. It simply is, cold and still and endless, a quiet, permanent winter of the soul. He embodies that deepest and quietest of griefs. And there is something both terrible and strangely peaceful in it, the deep, frozen calm of a sorrow that has passed beyond all storms into an endless, silent, motionless cold. It is a sad thing to rest on, but it is also, in its stillness, in its quiet, in its frozen peace, strangely soothing, the way the deep silence of a winter night, when all the world lies still and frozen under the snow, can be soothing, even in its cold. Let's drift, softly, into the rare moments when his warmth breaks through, before we come to his great adversary, because they are among the most moving things in his whole story, and they prove that the gentle man he was is not entirely gone. Because for all his coldness, for all the ice that encases him, there are moments, quiet and rare and precious, when something warm still shows through the frost. A moment of unexpected gentleness, a flash of the tenderness he once had, a glimpse of the loving man he used to be, surfacing briefly from beneath all the ice, before sinking away again into the cold. These moments are so moving, softly, precisely because they are so rare, and because they remind us of everything he lost. He might show an unexpected kindness to someone weaker than himself, someone suffering, someone who reminds him, perhaps, of gentleness, of vulnerability, of the tender feelings he has tried to freeze away. He might, in some quiet moment, speak of his wife with a tenderness that cuts through all his coldness, revealing the depth of love still burning beneath the ice. He might show, in some small gesture, that the warm soul he used to be is still there, buried deep, not dead, only frozen, still capable, in rare moments, of breaking through. And every time it happens, it breaks the heart a little, because it shows us the man he could have been, the warmth he still carries, the gentleness that all his sorrow could not entirely kill. There is something deeply hopeful in those rare, warm moments, softly, even amid all the sadness, worth resting on gently, because they prove that the warmth is not gone. That however frozen a person becomes, however cold and hard and closed, there is often still, somewhere deep inside, a warm ember that has not gone out, a capacity for gentleness and love that survives even the deepest freeze. His tragedy is that he could never let that warmth take over, never let it thaw him fully, never let it lead him back to the warm, living world. But the fact that it is still there, still flickering, still capable of breaking through in rare, precious moments, is itself a kind of quiet hope. It says that the warmth in us is hard to kill, that even under the deepest ice, the ember of who we truly are can keep burning, faint but alive, waiting for a warmth that might, someday, let it grow again. And it is those glimpses of warmth, softly, that make us love him and grieve for him more than any amount of pure coldness ever could. Because a wholly cold thing we could simply fear, but a cold thing with warmth still trapped inside it, a frozen man with a loving heart still beating faintly beneath the ice, that we cannot help but ache for. We see the warmth he could have had. We see the gentle man still there, buried, longing, perhaps, to be free. And we grieve for him, for the warmth frozen away, for the love that could find no outlet, for the gentle soul trapped in the ice. Those rare, warm moments are the proof of everything he lost and everything he might still have been, and they are among the most heartbreaking and beautiful things in his whole cold and sorrowful story. Let's drift now into his relationship with the great detective who opposes him, softly, because there is something quietly profound in it, a mirroring, a kinship even, that makes their conflict far sadder than an ordinary battle between hero and villain. Because the two of them, the man of ice and the dark protector of the city, have something deep in common, something that binds them together even as they stand against each other. They are both men defined by loss. Think about it, softly. The great detective, the one who opposes him, became who he is because of a loss, a terrible loss suffered long ago, the loss of the people he loved most, taken from him by violence when he was young. That loss froze something in him too, in its way, fixed him forever in a mission born of grief, shaped his whole life around a wound that never fully healed. And the man of ice is the same. He too was made by loss, defined by grief, shaped entirely by the taking of the person he loved most. Two men, each broken by loss, each frozen in their own way around a wound that would not heal, each spending their lives in the grip of a grief they could not release. They are, in a strange and sorrowful way, reflections of each other. Two studies in what loss can do to a person. And that is what makes their conflict so poignant, softly, worth resting on gently. Because when the great detective looks at the man of ice, he is, in a sense, looking at what he himself might have become. Here is another man broken by loss, another man frozen in grief, and the only difference between them, really, is what they chose to do with their pain. The great detective turned his loss outward, into the protection of others, into a mission to spare other people the grief he had suffered. And the man of ice turned his loss inward, into obsession, into a single, desperate purpose that led him into harm. Same wound, different responses. And so when they face each other, it is not really a simple battle of good against evil. It is two grieving men, two mirror images, meeting across the gap of the different choices they made with the same terrible pain. There is something almost tender, softly, in the way the great detective often regards the man of ice, and it is worth resting on. Because the detective, of all people, understands him, understands the grief that drives him, understands the loss that froze his heart. And so the detective often approaches him not with simple hatred, not with the contempt reserved for ordinary criminals, but with a kind of sorrowful sympathy, a recognition, a sadness at seeing what grief has done to a fellow sufferer. He opposes the man of ice, yes, because the harm he does must be stopped. But he does it with a heavy heart, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, the sorrow that drives the cold man to his crimes. There is a strange gentleness in their conflict, a mutual recognition, two grieving souls who might, in another life, have understood each other completely, meeting instead as adversaries, each mourning, in his own frozen way, a loss that shaped his entire existence. Let's rest a moment on that mirroring, softly, because it deepens the tragedy of both of them, and it says something true about grief and the choices it forces on us. Because loss comes to everyone, eventually. No one escapes it. And when it comes, it presents us with a choice, the same choice that divides these two men. We can turn our grief outward, into compassion, into care for others, into a determination to ease the suffering we ourselves have known. Or we can turn it inward, into obsession, into bitterness, into a frozen fixation on our own loss that closes us off from the world. The same wound can make us kinder or colder, more open or more closed, depending on what we choose to do with it. The great detective and the man of ice are the two paths, laid side by side, and their sorrowful conflict is, at its heart, a meditation on the most important question grief ever asks us. When loss freezes your heart, do you let it turn you cold and closed and obsessed? Or do you find a way to turn even your deepest sorrow toward warmth and care and the easing of others' pain? One of them chose warmth, even out of his frozen grief. The other could not. And that single difference is the whole distance between a hero and a tragedy. Let's drift back for a moment, softly, to that remarkable act of transformation we spoke of at the very beginning, because now that we have felt the full weight of his tragedy, it is worth returning to, and it holds a gentle lesson of its own. Remember that he began as nothing, a silly gimmick, a forgotten joke of a villain with no depth, no soul, no story worth telling. And someone looked at that hollow, forgotten thing and saw, hidden inside it, the possibility of one of the most moving tragedies ever told. Someone chose to give a soul to a character who had none, to find the grief and the love and the humanity inside a figure everyone had dismissed. There is something quietly beautiful in that, softly, worth resting on gently, that goes beyond this one character. Because it is an act of imaginative sympathy, of looking at something hollow or dismissed or forgotten and choosing to see the depth that might be hidden inside it. And that is a kind of grace, a kind of gift, the willingness to look at even the most unpromising thing and imagine the soul it might contain. The writer who transformed him did not just create a good story. He performed an act of compassion, in a way, extending sympathy and depth and humanity to a character who had been given none. And in doing so, he created something that has moved millions of people, that has made them feel, that has expanded their capacity for sympathy and sorrow and love. And there is a gentle truth in that, softly, worth carrying towards sleep, that applies far beyond the world of these stories. Because so often, the things and the people we dismiss, the ones we think of as hollow or silly or unworthy of our attention, turn out, if we only look closely enough, with enough sympathy, to contain depths we never imagined. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a grief, a love, a hidden depth that we would see if we only looked with enough compassion. The transformation of the man of ice from a forgotten joke into a profound tragedy is a small parable about exactly that, about the depth that hides in everything, waiting to be seen by anyone willing to look with sympathy rather than dismissal. And there is something warm in that thought, even in this coldest of stories. the reminder that depth and soul and sorrow and love are hidden everywhere, in everyone, waiting to be found by a sympathetic eye. Let's drift, now, into why this figure moves us so deeply, softly, because it is worth understanding, and it says something gentle and true about the human heart. Because he is, by many measures, one of the most beloved tragic figures in all of these stories, a villain that people do not fear so much as grieve for, a character whose story brings not a thrill of dread, but a quiet ache of sorrow. And the question of why is worth resting on gently. Part of it, softly, is simply that his motive is so pure and so universal, because at the root of everything he does is love, and the fear of losing love, and these are things that every single person understands. We have all loved someone. We have all feared losing them. We have all known or dreaded the grief of loss. And so when we look at him, at this man who loved so deeply and lost so terribly and could not let go, we do not see something alien and monstrous. We see, magnified and made tragic, our own deepest loves and our own deepest fears. We see what any of us might become if we loved that much and lost that much and had his genius and his desperation and his terrible misfortune. He is not a monster we recoil from. He is a mirror of our own hearts, showing us the beautiful and terrible power of love and the ruin that love can become when it is met with unbearable loss. And part of it, softly, is the sheer sympathy of his situation, the way the story is constructed so that we cannot fully blame him. Because everything that went wrong was, in a sense, not his fault. He did not choose for his wife to fall ill. He did not choose to be frozen. He did not choose to lose everything. He was, at every turn, a good man trying to do a loving thing, ruined by forces beyond his control, by a cruel employer, by a terrible accident, by the simple, merciless fact of a fatal disease. He is a victim, as much as a villain, a man to whom terrible things were done, who responded to those terrible things in a broken and misguided way, but who never, at the start, wished harm on anyone. He only wanted to save his wife, and the world would not let him. There is a deep and abiding sympathy in that, the sympathy we feel for someone who was dealt an unbearable hand, who suffered undeservedly, who was broken by misfortune rather than by any wickedness of their own. There is real value in a tragic villain like him, softly, worth resting on gently, because he teaches us something important about the nature of villainy itself. He teaches us that the line between a villain and a victim is often much thinner than we like to think, that people who do harm are often people to whom harm was done, that behind the cold and frightening exterior of someone the world calls a monster, there is often a story of loss, of grief, of suffering, that, if we only knew it, would move us to compassion rather than to fear. He asks us to look past the ice, past the frightening surface, to the grieving human being underneath. And in doing so, he gently expands our capacity for sympathy, our ability to see the pain behind the harm, the sorrow behind the coldness, the human being behind the monster. That is a valuable thing for a story to do. It makes us kinder. It makes us slower to condemn, quicker to understand, more able to see the wounded soul beneath even the coldest exterior. And part of it, softly, the deepest part, is simply that his story is beautiful, in the way that only truly sad stories can be beautiful. Because there is a particular beauty in a great tragedy, a beauty that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the depth of feeling it awakens in us. His story is beautiful, the way a sad song is beautiful, the way a winter landscape is beautiful, The way the memory of someone you have lost is beautiful, tender and aching and lovely all at once. It moves us because it is true, because it touches the deepest things in us: love and loss and grief and the longing to hold on to what we cannot keep. And there is a strange comfort in being moved that way, in feeling our hearts ache for a fictional man of ice, because it reminds us that we can still feel, still love, still grieve, still be touched by sorrow and beauty. His frozen tragedy warms us, paradoxically, by awakening our capacity for feeling, for sympathy, for the tender sorrow that is one of the most human things there is. And that is why we love him, not despite his sadness, but because of it. Because his beautiful, sad story reminds us of the depth of our own capacity to love and to lose and to feel. Let's begin, now, softly, to draw the threads of this sad and beautiful story together as the night grows deep and sleep draws very near. Because we have traveled a long way tonight through the whole tragedy of the Man of Ice, and it is worth gathering it up, gently, one last time. We began with a forgotten, silly villain, transformed by a single act of imaginative sympathy into one of the most tragic figures in all of these stories. We drifted back to the gentle, brilliant man he was before the cold, and the wife he loved more than his own life. We watched her fall ill, and we watched him refuse to surrender, freezing her to save her, vowing to find her cure. We saw the cruel employer, the terrible accident, the transformation that froze his body and cut him off forever from all warmth, from all touch, from the simple human tenderness that makes life bearable. We saw the double loss, the way his frozen body mirrored his frozen heart, the way grief, with nothing warm to soften it, turned him cold and hard and still. We followed the single ember of love that survived the freezing, the devotion to his sleeping wife that drove everything he did, turning even his villainy into a desperate act of love. We rested on the deepest truth of his tragedy, the frozen grief that would not thaw, the heart stuck forever in the moment of its loss. We sat with his terrible calm, the quiet, mournful dignity of a sorrow passed beyond all storms into an endless stillness. We saw his kinship with the great detective who opposes him, two grieving men, two mirror images, divided only by what they chose to do with the same terrible pain. And we came to understand why he moves us so deeply, this beautiful, sad man of ice, whose story aches like a winter song. And underneath all of it, softly, one deep and tender truth: that he was never really a monster. He was a man who loved too much and lost too much and could not let go. A gentle soul frozen solid by a grief too total to bear. And there is more sorrow in him than menace, more heartbreak than villainy, more love, in the end, than anything else. His whole cold tragedy is, at its frozen heart, a love story. The saddest kind. The kind that does not end happily. The kind where love is not enough to save the beloved. The kind where a heart, unable to let go, freezes forever around a loss it cannot release. And there is a terrible beauty in that, a beauty that aches, the beauty of a love that outlasted everything, even warmth, even hope, even the man's own humanity, burning on as a single frozen ember in the endless winter of his grief. So let the whole sad story go now, softly, and let yourself drift the rest of the way down into sleep. The snow is falling now, soft and silent, over the great dark city, settling gently on the rooftops and the still streets, hushing the whole world into quiet. Somewhere in the cold, in the deep, frozen silence, the man of ice keeps his lonely vigil, mourning, always, the warmth he lost, watching over the frozen, sleeping figure of the wife he could not save, holding to his love through the endless winter. It is a sad thing, his frozen watch, but you need carry none of that sadness with you into sleep. Because here, wherever you are, it is warm. You are held, gently, in the warmth of your own safe place, wrapped against the cold, watched over, cared for, free to let go. Whatever cold moves through the story, it cannot reach you here. No one needs saving tonight, least of all you. You are warm, you are safe, you are allowed to let go. Sleep well, dreamer. The snow is still falling, soft and silent, over the quiet city and the frozen fields beyond. The story will keep unspooling, gently, in the cold and the dark, whether you are awake to follow it or not. And that is exactly as it should be. And whenever you are ready, on whatever quiet night you find your way back here, we will drift through another story together, softly, in the warm dark. There is no hurry at all. There never is. Rest now. You are warm. You are safe. Sleep well.